بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا وقدوتنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأزكى التسليم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Thank you for inviting me into your community again. This has been a wonderful trip so far. Very humbled by the welcome and the conversations. Lovely community, a beautiful place that you live in with beautiful people. May Allah bless you and increase you. I couldn't have, if I had the task of writing the, if I had the task of writing the speech of the person before me, I could not have written a better one and a more munasib one, a more appropriate segue than what Imam Tom just shared with us. Because if we're to deconstruct, as Sheikh Suhail said, the title, the title of the talk, we have knowledge over here, okay, and perhaps an arrow, and we have action over here, right? And so the question then becomes, what's missing from that equation? How do you get from one side of the equation to the other? What stands in between of those two things?
Resources?
No, not resources. Yeah, that's a real question. That's not istifham kali. That's
Commitment?
Commitment? No. Huh? Passion? No. You got thinking so abstract. Passion? No. I don't know. What brings action to life? People. Exactly. That there is a person that acts. The knowledge doesn't act, correct? It's the person who acts. So if you want to ask the question that the Imam was having us think about, okay, there are people out there that just increase knowledge, accumulate knowledge. Okay, what's value, right? Versus the person who has, maybe they only know one thing or two things, and yet they're firing on all cylinders. Everything that they know, they're putting it into action. What's the difference between those two people? Is actually an ethical decision. It's a moral decision, right? So if you want to create an institution, information and knowledge is secondary or tertiary even. You're thinking about creating people. You are here to create people. And the first question in front of you is, what type of people do you want to create? And how are you going to create those types of people? And then obviously the obvious questions everyone thinks about, what's going to be on the syllabus and how are we going to arrange this and that and the other, but that's all downstream of what is the type of person that we want to lead this institution? How are they going to act in the world? Okay, so that's a very, very interesting thing. And one of the, maybe an analogy that came to mind when I was sitting listening to Sheikh Suhail with his intro was whittling wood, right? It's very, very interesting. We think about, you have a block of wood or a branch or something like that, and you start carving. Every act of removing wood is doing two things at one time. You're both moving closer to the thing that the wood is going to become, and you are simultaneously choosing not to be all the other things that the wood could have become. Okay? That is how knowledge interacts with a human being. That everything that somebody learns, it is transformational. That you are enabling someone to become something else, and you are simultaneously preventing them from becoming a whole lot of other things, right? So those are the decisions that are front and center in your mind when you're thinking about, okay, we want an educational institution. Now that blows the doors off the whole thing, because if that's the level that you're thinking at, now it's like, well, what's the role of the classroom? What's the role of the table? What's the role of the chairs? What's the role of the teachers? Everything else is flexible. It's flexible. And you might make decisions that are very unorthodox. Not Islamically, I'm talking about conventionally. Let's say unconventional, right? When it comes to what your educational institution is going to look like. Will it be a school? Well, a school's one way of doing education, but it's certainly not the only way, right? There was education before there were schools. And as we know now, anybody who grew up and went through the public education system, sometimes schools get in the way of education, and in fact thwart education, true education. What's going to be the relationship between the student and the teacher? What's going to be the relationship between the student and that which they learn? What opportunities are you going to give the student to fail and to learn from failure? These are all things that must be questioned, but they all must be questioned with the main question in mind, which is, what people are we trying to create? You know, Imam Taha also referenced some things that I had also planned on saying, so I won't tire you or worry you with repetition, but throughout our tradition, we have this ethic when it comes to knowledge, both not acting before we have knowledge, right? Most of the hadith books, they start with a chapter on knowledge before action, that your action must be guided by knowledge, but simultaneously, that knowledge without action is perhaps even worse. Right? Knowledge without action is perhaps even worse, and you'll find many, verses of poetry expressing this idea. You also have the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ describing the first three people to be thrown into the hellfire on the Day of Judgment. It's not the Zionist, though maybe we wish it was. It's the phony scholar. It's the phony qari. It's the phony mutasaddiq. It's the person who basically they had knowledge, and yet it was for the wrong reasons, and yet it was not applied, or it was misapplied, even worse. Right? That this is a major, major deal. Knowledge is an ethical venture, primarily, inherently, and fundamentally. Now, what's the moment in which we live? 2024, 1445, whatever year you reckon, that we have a very, very a problematic relationship with our tradition. I mean, alhamdulillah, we know that our tradition is something that's very preserved. It's probably the most preserved sets of traditions of any civilization, perhaps, ever, which is really cool, honestly, and it's very, very exciting. And nerds like us, love that stuff. We can go just reading, different factoids. We're talking about some of the ulum that we would go into just for fun if there wasn't a genocide going on and other more pressing issues to go into, right? It's inexhaustible. However, that becomes a type of challenge, because if you have this, some call it turath, so that's kind of a neologism, this tradition that you have, what's our relationship to that tradition? How are we interacting with it? How are we interpreting it? How do we make sense of it? If we feel, and many Muslims across the world these days do feel, that we are in survival mode, then a type of desperation comes in. And desperation is rarely a good thing. It's different from urgency. Desperation is tied to despair, right? And so if our feeling that's sort of animating how we relate to our tradition is one of this sort of desperate survival mode, then what we often do is we often try to freeze and ossify our tradition, right? We become only concerned with the form of repeating our tradition. And this looks like many things that you and I enjoy. Come down and we sit down and let's read through the Ihya, right? We're going to go through the Ihya every day or every week until we get to the end of it in a year or 2 years. Alhamdulillah, that's beautiful. Okay? But it's also a limitation, because we're not looking at something else, which is who's going to write the Ihya of our time, right? Who's going to be the Al-Ghazali of our time, or the Ibn Taymiyyah, whatever you prefer. All flavors welcome here. Chocolate some days, vanilla the other, right? But the point is that, how do we relate to this tradition? Are we only, by the way, and this is a brief aside, and we were talking about this earlier, on the beach or on the way to the beach. You can say that in San Diego, mashallah, it sounds so nice. We talk about this on the way to the beach. That Al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah can be seen as complementary forces, honestly. Like they are, sometimes they're seen as competitors and conflicting forces. But within the intellectual tradition of Islam, they can really be understood as complementary forces, both different types of responses to the philosophers and the hyper-rationalists, coming from two different angles. Now that's important because whatever your flavor, if you're a Taymiyyan or you're a Ghazali, what we're concerned with is not just the rote repetition of what they have done, but to raise among us the Ibn Taymiyyahs and the Ghazalis of today. What they did is what we need to do. And the relationship of us to them is not one of parroting or aping. Anybody can do that. We can sit here and read Darba Ta'awud or Al-Ihya or whatever else, and there is benefit. Alhamdulillah, there's benefit. But the moment calls for something greater. The moment calls for us taking very seriously building the institutions, whatever they look like, whether it's under a tree or in a classroom, that is going to produce the Ibn Taymiyyah of this time, and produce the Al-Ghazali of this time, and write the Ihya of this time, responding to the issues of this time, and write the Darba Ta'awud of this time, responding to the issues of that time. Those are the people that we need to produce. So if you are an engineer, the question then is to work backwards. How do we work backwards from that's our end goal to produce the dominoes or set up the dominoes that they'll knock one into the other, so that we can produce these types of human beings to revive. That's essentially what we're talking about, to revive both Islam, the sciences, Islam, everything else. So there's some ideas that I have, and I'll share them with you, and they're very provisional. It's not dogma. It's just my sort of madness expressing itself in words. For some different sectors, and some of the brothers actually came up to me and they're wondering about this sector and that sector, and I'm going to give you not even a grain of salt and an enormous lump of salt. Any Turks in here? Anybody Turkey? No? Okay. Well, there's a beautiful tradition. Well, I don't know if it's beautiful, but there's a tradition in Turkey where if a man comes to propose to a girl's father, the girl goes and makes tea, and she puts salt in it instead of sugar. And so he has to sit there and drink the whole thing. And if he really wants to get married, he has to finish it, right? So imagine I'm going to just offer a giant lump of salt here, not just a grain. That I am very limited in what I know. I only have certain training, so I only see certain things, right? I am horrible at business. I have no business sense whatsoever. I'm even worse at technology, right? My training is in political theory. It's in the humanities, it's in Shari'a, alhamdulillah. And so I have some provisional ideas about other things, but this is why it's a conversation and we benefit from each other, because some of you will see things that I don't see. And that's actually what we're here for. The Ummah benefits, yashuddu ba'duna ba'da, right? We strengthen each other. But everything comes back to, right, if we're to imagine this venture as a tree that has roots and a trunk and then branches and then leaves and then fruit, that the roots and maybe even the trunk as well is Islamic learning, right? Is learning about Islam. Now, there's a couple things that we need to take into account when we think about what it means to teach Islam or Islamic education. We've already talked about a couple of them. Is a school the best vehicle or the only vehicle for this type of revival that we've talked about? It has limitations and it has benefits, right? There's a difference, and even when I was a student in Medina, there was a clear difference between from Fajr to Dhuhr at the Islamic University with tables and chairs and credentials and these sorts of things, versus between Asr and Isha at the Haram, which is sitting at the feet of the Shaykh. Right? It's two very, very different styles of learning. Each of them has strengths, each of them has weaknesses, but the question is, are we making an intentional decision with how we seek to educate Islamically, or are we making sort of a taqlidi decision? We're just sort of, well, this is the way it's always been done, and this is what we're going to do, as we say, come hell or high water. We probably need to be a little bit more intentional in these decisions to match the vehicle to the desired end. If we're really after revival, if we're really after Islamic education producing human beings that we're after, what is the proper vehicle or are the proper vehicles. There might be more than one. We also need to undo secularism, which is no small task, because secularism, when it came to the Muslim world, one of the first things that it did, after, if we get to speak at the encampment tonight, inshallah, I'll talk about the first thing it did. But the second thing that it did was it changed Islamic education, right? From something where Islam was a filter and a worldview through which everything else was put, and through which everything else was learned, even. So we're talking about learning math, we're talking about learning astronomy, we're talking about learning business. Everything was through Islam, and Islam was not separatable from those subjects or from those disciplines. So the colonizers came along and they separated. They said, okay, you guys are going to do Islamic studies over here, and then over here you have the real subjects of math and science and literature and these sorts of things. And unfortunately, they subtly colonized our minds as well, and our feelings even, to the point where we look at science as, well, up here, the absolute miqyas of haqq, right? The, how do you translate that? The ultimate authority and arbiter of what is true, right? And if you can't be a doctor, or you can't be a lawyer, or you can't be an engineer, then you can go study the Shari'a. You can do Islamic studies, unfortunately. And that's over across the Muslim world, unfortunately. And I experienced directly myself, unfortunately. So that has to be undone. So there's two elements to that. One is a cultural change, where we have to prioritize Islamic learning to our youth and give it sharaf, and give it honor. That means that you would be surprised at how many people reach out to me and say, Imam Tom, my son or my daughter wants to study at X seminary or X institution. And I'm like, that's great. And they're like, no, it's not great. What do I do? I want them to go into this other major. Right? It's like how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described the Quraysh when they were informed that they would be having daughters. Right? You see their face change, and swaddat wujuhum, right? They sort of, their face darken. They consider it a calamity. If you want to go to Deoband, or you want to go to Medina, or you want to go to Fez or Turkey to study the deen, they consider it a calamity. So do not we have a share of blame in the secularization of our own knowledge? Of course we have a share of blame. And so you need to give it sharaf. You need to give studying Islam seriously honor, the honor it deserves. And if your child memorizes Quran, or if they want to actually dedicate themselves to studying the deen in a serious way, it should be cause for celebration. And it should be something that you encourage. And I'll even tell an anecdote here that's I didn't plan on sharing, which is if you don't, you might unfortunately see some negative consequences. I was in Toronto one time, and I was in a hotel lobby. I was sort of doing some work and things like that, and there was a young lady who was there as well, and she was on the phone, and she was dressed in such a way that, let's just say, you had to face the wall to satisfy Allah's limits. And then I heard her say Wallahi on the phone, and I kind of my head snapped, and I realized that yes, she was Muslim. Now, after she got off the phone, I said Assalamu alaikum, and we sort of started talking. And subhanAllah, she kind of opened up about her path, and it was very sad. She said that when she was a young girl, like a teenager, she asked her father to go study at an Islamic seminary, and her father said no. And that basically, you could see the hurt in her eyes as she told the story, that was a life-changing decision for her. That it set her down a very, very different path in life, a path that took her further away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And she herself felt far from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So take that as a cautionary tale, that if you might think that you're saving your child in some sort of way, their future, their prospects, by shutting some door to Islamic knowledge, but you might be actually opening a door of fasad, or a door to something that is even worse, that you would not like. So we need to give it sharaf. We need to change our culture when it comes to our relationship, okay? And that involves priorities and your choices. You teach your children much more through your choices than you do through your words, okay? So if Muhammad has soccer practice and it conflicts with Quran class, do you miss soccer practice for Quran, or do you miss Quran for soccer practice? okay? I'm not here to out anybody, just ask yourself, right? But you teach your children. You teach your children what is really priority when you make these types of decisions. You do, and they learn. Children are not stupid. Children are extremely intelligent. And they see you, and they watch you. They're little, like, surveillance bots. You know, they watch everything you do. They pick up everything that you do, for better and for worse. So we need to give it shaf. We need to take this seriously. We need to change that culture. And we need to also reintegrate Islam. And this is why I began with questioning the ideas of school. Because we have Islamic schools across the country, and many of them are horrible. Many of them are, quite frank, they're terrible. In many ways, not just the things that people know about being underfunded and understaffed and poorly qualified. And that's just the icing on the cake, right? Some of them, Islam is really just for marketing and lip service. Right? I saw a very large, well-known school in an undisclosed location, I'm not going to say, so you don't put the dots, that I looked at this, I asked to see the schedule of classes, and there were math and science and this and that, and then Islamic studies was every other day alternating with gym class. And so I said, what are you teaching the students of your school through how you arrange your class periods? You're teaching them that Islam is, first of all, you made it into a waste bin category, which is what most Islamic schools do. We'll just tuck everything into Islamic studies and dabr halik, right? It's both Quran and Hadith and Seerah and Fiqh, and all these things are now just Islamic studies a couple times a week. And you basically communicated to them that, well, we're going to teach you math every day, so that really is what counts. That's what you taught them. So we need to fix this. If we want any sort of educational institution, it needs to communicate the right priorities, not just us in our homes, but through the structure. The structure has to communicate the right priorities. That Islam should be something that permeates every subject. It should be reintegrated into every subject. That math is Islamic. Science is Islamic. History is definitely Islamic. Right? These are things that the segregation of which has done more disservice to us than the integration prior. We also need to realize, and we've talked about this sort of a bit before, that knowledge is not information. And this is a lie, and it's part of the modern sort of way of doing things, to consider knowledge as simply information. Whereas knowledge, more appropriately, is transformation. Knowledge is transformation. And this is what we talked about in the beginning with the wood, whittling wood, these sorts of things. Everything that you learn shapes who you are. It's the border and boundary of what you can be. It's the border and boundary of what you can think. If you are what you eat, you are what you know, even more so. So we need to take that extremely, extremely seriously. Now, branching out from that, if we're able to sort of fix that or do that justice when it comes to our institutions of Islamic learning, then, and we've already sort of addressed the idea of what type of human beings we want to produce. Now we have to take a look towards society, and this is getting more to what Sheikh Shari'a was saying about the idea of khilafah. And indeed, Al-Kalam in Al-Kalam Shari'a, he talks about al-khilafah as being the utmost purpose, right? The steward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one who achieves Allah's wish on earth, runs things on earth the way Allah wants them to be run. This is the ultimate goal of every human being, man, woman, child, everybody. For Muslims, this is our ultimate goal. So, you can't have the individualistic careerist attitude that we described yesterday in yesterday's talk when it comes to your major, when it comes to your livelihood, what you're going to do. It's not acceptable anymore. You can't be a Khalifa on earth and you're just thinking, well, you know, doctor will bring me a lot of sort of status in society and will make marriage prospects easier and I'll make a lot of money, so that's what I'm going to go with. No, what does the world need? What does the ummah need? Right? And this is khilafah thinking and khilafah mindset, where now you're trying to look across society and sectors and you're trying to identify where you can fit in, how you can leverage the skills that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you and the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has shown you to achieve that, to achieve that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants. And so I've just got a couple, I think like maybe 4 sectors and just sort of my thoughts on some things there. And that will be sort of a launch pad probably for some discussion once we get into the Q&A, which I always favor more Q&A. You guys never give enough time. Not you, Sheikh Sohail, talking about masajid, institutions. No one ever gives enough time for Q&A. Q&A should be at least half the time allotted. Anyway, So some of which we've talked about before. Law is a very, very important sector that we're very, very well behind in. We are only to date concerned about litigating discrimination within the structure of the law as it is, which is a very, very limited sort of area or arena in which to act, as opposed to doing what many other groups do, which is trying to change the terrain of the law itself. Okay? It's no secret that the anti-terror legislation was made to criminalize Muslims, and that is just a fact, right? So, to which extent can then there's two paths to pursue, okay? You can pursue the path to say, well, we want this legislation now to apply evenly to the KKK and evenly to the IDF and the Zionists and evenly to this and that. That's one way. But don't hold your breath. Because honestly, from the outset, it was never meant to be neutral and applied evenly. It was termed in a supposedly neutral way, but it was really devised to punish and criminalize you and me. And so then, if that's the nature of sort of the situation that we're facing, who are going to be the Muslim lawyers who come up, or legal scholars, maybe it's not even lawyers, that are able to figure out a way past this? How can we take the teeth out of it? How can we demolish or dismantle anti-terror legislation, quote unquote, and the other sorts of plastic words that they've invented that also criminalize Muslims, such as extremism, these sorts of things, that have no real meaning in and of themselves, that are very thinly veiled Trojan horses to punish the Muslim community and keep us subjugated. This is something that has to be figured out. And if we're only sort of raising the types of individuals who are going to sort of safely operate in the system, yes, okay, there's anti-discrimination law, and we are sort of adopting only the grievance culture of I didn't get treated fairly, etc. We might win a few cases here and there, but we will fail to change the way the game is played. And if you have a choice between playing the game and winning once in a while versus changing the way the game is played so you can win more, you always have to go for the second. You always have to go for changing the rules of the game so that you're in a much better position to win in the future. Human rights law is also very similar. A lot of people don't know that human rights, again, very seemingly neutral language, but the history of the terminology, who invented it and who initially deployed it, is very, very different. You guys know that the first term, or the first usage of the term crimes against humanity was by the British in the Treaty of Sevres, when they were about to cut off the Ottoman Empire. Okay, the initial terms of the treaty, it was for crimes against Christendom, was the initial terminology. That was what they were going to supposedly justify cutting up the Ottoman Empire and Turkey for. And then the French said, wait a second, we have a lot of holdings in West Africa. We have many subjects that are Muslim. This language is going to be inflammatory. We need to find a different term. And so they said, I know, we'll say crimes against humanity instead. So what was the human that was behind the crimes against humanity? Was it really all of humanity that was meant from the beginning? And the answer is no, it was not. Just as when the American Constitution was made, were African Americans understood as we the people, part of we the people? No, they were not. Were Native Americans understood as part of we the people? No, they were not. What was the type of freedom that John Locke articulated? It was the freedom of the white plantation owner. That's it. That's what he meant. So, we have to ask ourselves that question. How much do we want to try to, pardon the expression, put lipstick on a pig, right? It's the first thing that came to mind. We have this expression, to put lipstick on a pig, right? We can put lipstick on a pig all we want, it's still a pig at the end of the day, right? Like, there's other ways to go about and different moves to be made, and at least if we're making an intentional decision as to which strategies we're going, as opposed to what we're at right now is just mindlessly going, we're looking over at the gays are playing the anti-discrimination law, we're going to do that too. That's what we're doing right now. That's not strategic, right? You have to think layers, and then you have to choose what's the proper sort of strategy and way to move forward, given the realities on the ground. Economics is another very, very important sector that I already caveated by saying I don't know a whole lot about, but from my perspective, we have not leveraged power in the economic sectors in which we have numbers. right? So for example, we know that Muslims are well represented as doctors, alhamdulillah. We have not leveraged that into any sort of collective power, however. We have not sort of launched our own health systems or health networks. We have not necessarily gotten into health administration, right, or even public health to change, again, not just to get a few wins here and there, but to change the way that the game is played, or to change the rules by which the game is played. So this came to a head after October 7th. You know, if you were a Muslim doctor in a hospital system, right, maybe the people who ran the hospital systems were Zionists, right? Maybe they put out a statement, we stand with Israel, after October 7th. Maybe the president or the CEO of the hospital system had an Israeli flag outside of his office door. And what could you do, right? All of that population that we had was not organized population, and therefore it couldn't do anything. So there's a lot of things that we could do, right, to organize, even if it's walkouts and strikes and things like that, starting up our own hospital systems, or thinking about sort of, again, how to change the sector, right, how to change not just an individual institution or one-on-one sort of dawah, that's always going on, alhamdulillah, but how to change the actual sector. And health is just one sort of example, because we have, you know, we're pretty well represented when it comes to health. When it comes to other things as well, we talked about employment in general, right? Just the structure of having to work for somebody who might want to see you dead, or wouldn't mind if you were killed by one of these counter-protesters, you know, etc. That's a vulnerability that you have to take very seriously. You know, Malcolm X, rahimahullah, he said that if you have to depend upon your enemy for a job, you're in a sorry situation, right? And we haven't taken the initiative right now. We've been content with being employees, generally, and that can't last. That's not a sustainable strategy. We have to crack the barrier and go into sort of creating autonomy through different sectors by having our own sort of, our own networks, our own employability. We should never have to fear. Okay, and I speak as someone who works full-time at Yaqeen Institute. Yaqeen Institute enables me to say anything I want about Palestine, right? And so, mashallah, because of that leverage that I have and that freedom that I have, I can say what I need to say, right? We need to think about how to establish that type of autonomy in other sectors, wherever Muslims happen to be, even with cab drivers, even with, you know, wherever Muslims are, wherever we have numbers, organize ourselves in such a way so that they're similarly protected, that if they're let go or fired in a political way, that we are able to take care of them, right? This is how every community succeeds. And Malcolm X has written a lot about this. You should, some of his work on black nationalism and black economics, it goes into this in more depth. We have yet to apply and implement his wisdom. And the last thing with economics, I know this was mentioned by Sheikh Suhail about currency. You know, currency is kind of a big nut to crack, but you know, I figured just to throw it in the bin, or to throw it in the mix, it's one to think about, right? Like, currency is very, very linked to autonomy. Take, for example, any Muslim, and I referenced this yesterday, any Muslim government that comes into power that our nation, the United States, ceases to like, or sort of runs afoul of this nation can turn the spigot off right away. It's got the gold vaults in Colorado and Nebraska, right? All your $9 trillion in gold bars and assets that held in the United States, they can cut it off right away. Dr. Hattab Bazian, your own, California's own, right, founder of SJP and AMP, he had his E-Trade account completely removed. Now, they didn't give him a reason, but it's likely for his Palestinian activism. He's a big target. So if you have a bank and you have money in the bank and you use PayPal or you use Venmo or you use any of these sorts of things, we're not too many steps away from having everything that you have shut off, locked up, frozen, seized even. So it would behoove Muslims to think about building autonomy in this sector as well, like some sort of Muslim PayPal, some sort of Muslim currency. Even. There's many, many things that we can do. I think that, again, strategically thinking as a community, that's where we have to put some serious brain power. And I know I'm running up against time, so I'll sort of breeze through some of the rest, and then we'll go to whatever's next, questions or refreshments, I'm not sure. Politics is obviously a key sector that's on many people's minds. we've seen interesting sort of energy being spent in the last 6 months. We've realized, I think, the hurt and the need to participate more in politics, but we're still very infantile, sort of learning how to do it and making a lot of mistakes, and that's normal. We can learn a lot from what they're doing in the UK with the Muslim vote. The Muslim vote, if you check out the website, they have very, very comprehensive data about where the Muslims live, what are the districts in which they have a majority, what are the districts in which they have the ability to tip the scale based off of past election records. And so you're not wasting time by putting money and effort into a district that's sort of already out of the question. So those sorts of things are needed when it comes to political action committees, when it comes to voter education, when it comes to grading politicians, right? If you're any part of any environmental organization, they'll send you every quarter or every year, the election's about to come, a report on all your representatives from the local up to the national with grades, A, B, F, depending on how they voted on those issues. So we as Muslims also have to develop a platform. What are our issues, right? And then how do we go ahead and grade politicians, representatives on these things? And how do we hold them accountable to our platform? This is basic stuff. We don't have yet a national Muslim community-based organization that deals with electoral politics 4 seasons out of the year. We don't. CARE deals with elections when they come. That's not their main thing. CARE usually deals with litigation and anti-discrimination law and things like that. Engage is an AstroTurf organization. They're not representative of the Muslim community whatsoever. They're propped up by the Democratic Party and insiders. Sorry if I might offend some people, but it's true, and I have receipts. So if you want to know, I can definitely send lots of receipts. So we need a grassroots Muslim organization that will pay attention to electoral politics 24/7 every day of the year and develop these strategies and focus people's money. And it's your duty when those things come along to put some of your sadaqah towards that, not just relief work. Relief work's important, but 15% of your sadaqah or whatever every year to political sort of things. That way we can get to a point where we're not just reacting, which we're doing currently, but we get ahead of the game and then we start actually shaping what's going to happen. For example, we start recruiting candidates, we start training them, we start funding them, and then we put them forth. Right now we're just sort of looking at who's in the pipeline, who's coming by, oh, that guy's the least bad, right? That's not a strategy. That's just failure, to be honest, right? And we need to break through to get to the point where we're acting intentionally, we're acting ahead of time, and that we know what we're doing. Last point on the political sector is that grassroots is extremely important. There are some things that are basically unforgivable that we've dropped the ball on when it comes to your local city councils and your local school boards. This is stuff that's no-brainer. Like, even if you have reservations against voting at the federal level, which I mentioned yesterday, I can respect. That there's no excuse to not get involved in your school board, especially with all the trash that they're teaching your kids, if you have still kept your kids in public education. Those are things that we need to be better about and more intentional. Last thing, in the 2 minutes I have left, is tech and telecom, and I said I know the least about that, so forgive me for my ignorance, but I think all of us have seen how media shapes what people believe. Now, we have a unique moment that we live in because the democratization of media since 2015 roughly has been unprecedented, and it terrifies power, the people in power. It has terrified them completely. You see all of the legislation that has been pushed across, even the stuff that's like symbolic without teeth or enforcement mechanisms. You see Elon Musk being called in by Netanyahu to take some sort of birthright trip to Israel. You see Facebook and Instagram coming up with the opt-in for political content. They are terrified. TikTok, right, being sort of sanctioned at the federal level. They are terrified of the democratization of information because it will break the monopoly on the narrative that they have worked, and the Zionists in particular have worked so hard on keeping the lid on. We have to be a player in that game, okay? Whether it comes from establishing our own platforms, that is essential. We're relying on the charity of Elon Musk, right, who's a very shady character, basically to keep some sort of platform open for us to speak somewhat freely. And even with X, there's tons of problems and limitations to it. We're only, again, like the other things, we're only a couple of acts of legislation away from even losing the little bit of room that we have already to maneuver. So we can wait like sitting ducks until it happens, or we can take initiative now and start building something that we can actually fall back on if that were to come. So media in general, social media, and then telecom in general. You know, this phone is, you know, most deaf said it back in the 2000s, right? So they can hear what you say when you're not at home, right? That these things are spying on us. That, again, we're just one sort of executive directive away from all of your information being shared and mined and etc. It's probably already happening with Israeli software and things like that. Are we able to build our own telecom networks? Are we able to build our own sort of autonomy in that, where we're going to have a sort of harder resistance towards government encroachment? We don't trust Google. We believe Google will sell us out in an instant. They will turn over all of our information to the government if they ask. The others as well, Apple, etc. So what are we going to do to hedge against that possibility? What are we going to do as a Muslim community? We have so many people who know so much about tech. What are we going to be able to do to build platforms and networks to resist that type of thing, or at least to make it not an inevitability? Those are serious things to consider. So we've gone far away from our initial sort of starting point, but these things are not possible if we don't take care of the first thing, right? And the first thing we talked about is the human being. That Islamic education, you're really trying to build human beings, and that human beings are going to solve these issues. Maybe you and I aren't going to solve these issues, but maybe the next crop of Muslims that we nurture can. And so we have to be very intentional and very smart and start taking initiative, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put barakah in our efforts. We don't believe, we're not materialists. We don't believe that we have to be exactly like the Zionists and trick everybody and put money and buy people. We believe that if we're on the side of truth, that Allah will help His cause, right? If you help Allah's cause, Allah will help you. But what's required of us is effort, right? Just as the Prophet ﷺ, when he conducted himself in the battle of Al-Ahzab, that what was required of them was building the trench. We need to build our trench. We need to dig. Pick up your shovels and do what you can. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.
MashaAllah, jazakumullah khairan, Imam Tom, for that enlightening talk. So today, right now, inshallah, we'll have a break for 15 minutes. There are refreshments. I don't know what's there, but you can check it out, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. Inshallah, after the refreshments, we're gonna have Q&A, so you can ask all your questions.
At this point, we'll make it very specific. But right now, I just mentioned that we just set the stage for Jazakallah khair. I noticed that if you have any questions,